Captain Lisa Morgan had been flying passenger planes for 15 years. Calm, routine flights, coffee service, polite passengers. But that morning, when 4 enemy fighter jets appeared on her radar, no one knew who she truly was as she ran toward the F-16 waiting at the airfield. Welcome to Velvo Stories, where ordinary faces hide extraordinary pasts, and heroism speaks not in words, but actions. If you believe legends only wear uniforms, think again. The morning sun painted the sky in soft pastels as Captain Lisa Morgan completed her pre-flight checklist for Atlantic Airways Flight 447, a routine domestic route from Denver International Airport to Seattle-Tacoma. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the regulation ponytail that had become second nature over her 15 years as a commercial pilot, and her blue eyes methodically scanned the instrument panel with the practiced efficiency of someone who had logged over 20,000 flight hours in passenger aircraft. To her passengers, her crew, and even most of her colleagues, Lisa was exactly what she appeared to be: a competent, reliable commercial pilot who had built her career on safety, punctuality, and the kind of steady professionalism that made flying feel routine rather than remarkable. She had earned her captain's stripes through years of disciplined service, had never had a serious incident, and was known among her peers as someone who could handle turbulence with the calm demeanor that passengers found reassuring. What none of them knew was that before Lisa Morgan had ever set foot in a commercial cockpit, she had been Captain Lisa Morgan, United States Air Force, assigned to the most classified flight test program in military history. As she ran through her final systems checks, Lisa's radio crackled with the familiar voice of Denver Control. Atlantic 447, you're cleared for takeoff, runway 34L. Have a smooth flight to Seattle. Atlantic 447, cleared for takeoff, 34L, Lisa responded, her voice carrying the professional calm that had become her trademark. Thank you, Denver. She advanced the throttles on the Boeing 737. Feeling the familiar surge of power as the aircraft began its takeoff roll. This was her favorite moment of any flight, the transition from earthbound machinery to airborne freedom, the moment when tons of metal and hundreds of people trusted physics and her skill to carry them safely into the sky. As the aircraft lifted off and began its climb toward cruising altitude, Lisa allowed herself a small smile. Flight 447 was carrying 164 passengers, including families heading to Seattle for vacation, business travelers with laptops already open, and a group of elderly passengers on what appeared to be an organized tour. All of them trusted her to get them safely to their destination, and she had never let passengers down. But as they reached 15,000 feet, something changed.
All aircraft. This is Denver Control with emergency traffic advisory. We have unidentified military aircraft approaching restricted airspace. All civilian traffic maintain current altitude and heading until further notice. Lisa's training kicked in immediately, but not the training her passengers would have expected. While commercial aviation experience told her to follow Denver Control's instructions and wait for further guidance, another part of her mind, a part that had been dormant for over a decade, began automatically analyzing the tactical situation. Unidentified military aircraft approaching restricted airspace could mean many things, but the level of alarm in the controller's voice suggested this wasn't a training exercise or a simple navigation error. Lisa's hands remained steady on the controls, but her eyes began scanning the horizon with an intensity that went far beyond normal commercial pilot procedures. Atlantic 447, this is Denver Control. Begin immediate descent to 10,000 feet and prepare for possible diversion to alternate airport. Denver Control, Atlantic 447, beginning descent to 10,000 feet. Lisa acknowledged, but even as she began the descent, she was accessing systems and information that most commercial pilots would never think to check. The Boeing 737's weather radar could be reconfigured to detect other aircraft under certain circumstances, and Lisa switched the display to a mode that few pilots knew existed. What she saw made her blood run cold. 4 aircraft, flying in tight formation, approaching from the northwest at high speed and low altitude. They were too fast to be commercial aircraft and flying in a pattern that suggested military training, but they weren't responding to air traffic control, and their approach vector would bring them directly over one of the most sensitive military installations in the region. Lisa's mind raced through possibilities. Could this be a training exercise that hadn't been properly coordinated with civilian air traffic control? Could it be foreign military aircraft conducting reconnaissance? Or could it be something worse, a direct threat to American airspace that required immediate response? As if in answer to her thoughts, her radio erupted with traffic that confirmed her worst fears. "Mayday, mayday, mayday! This is Buckley Air Force Base to all aircraft. We have confirmed hostile aircraft inbound to restricted military airspace. All civilian aircraft clear the area immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Lisa's heart rate increased, but her hands remained steady on the controls. Around her, she could hear other commercial pilots responding with confusion and alarm. Most of them were asking for clarification, requesting vectors away from the area, following the procedures they'd been trained to follow in emergency situations. But Lisa wasn't like most commercial pilots. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," she announced over the intercom, her voice calm and professional despite the crisis developing around them. "We're experiencing some air traffic control delays that require us to make an unscheduled landing in Denver. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we coordinate with ground control." What she didn't tell them was that she was already calculating the fastest route back to Denver International Airport, not because it was the safest place for her passengers, but because Denver International had something she needed, an Air Force reserve wing with combat aircraft. As Lisa began her approach back to Denver, she could see the situation developing on the horizon. 4 aircraft, she could now identify them as foreign-built fighter jets, were approaching Colorado airspace at high speed. They were flying with the confidence of pilots who didn't expect to encounter resistance, and their flight path would take them directly over several critical infrastructure targets. "Denver Control, this is Atlantic 447, requesting emergency landing, runway 34 left," Lisa called, her voice maintaining its professional calm, even as she was already planning actions that would have shocked everyone who knew her. "Atlantic 447, cleared for emergency approach runway 34 left. Emergency vehicles are standing by." As the Boeing 737 touched down and rolled to a stop, Lisa was already unbuckling her harness and preparing for what came next. Her co-pilot, First Officer Johnson, looked at her in confusion. "Captain, what's the emergency? All our systems are showing normal." Lisa looked at Johnson, a good pilot, but someone who had never served in the military, someone who had no idea what was really happening beyond the routine emergency procedures they had been trained to follow. "Take care of the passengers," she said simply. "Make sure they're safely evacuated and transferred to the terminal. Tell them there was a mechanical issue that requires inspection." "But Captain, where are you going?" Lisa was already moving toward the exit, her mind focused on something far beyond Johnson's understanding. "I have to check on something with maintenance," she said, knowing it was a lie, but unable to explain the truth. As Lisa left the aircraft, she could see the confusion and mild alarm of her passengers as they were directed toward buses that would take them to the terminal. They trusted her to resolve whatever technical problem had forced their early landing, and she would, but not in any way they could imagine. Instead of heading toward the terminal, Lisa moved quickly toward a section of Denver International Airport that few civilians ever saw, the Air Force Reserve Wing, where military aircraft were maintained and prepared for missions that most people never heard about.
The security fence that separated the civilian airport from the military section would have stopped most people, but Lisa remembered things that 15 years of commercial flying hadn't erased. She knew which gates were monitored only by cameras, which access codes hadn't been changed since her military service, and how to move through secure facilities without attracting attention. Within minutes, she was standing on the military side of the airport, looking at a sight that made her heart race with a mixture of fear and anticipation. 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons, fueled and armed, sitting on the tarmac with no pilots in sight. The Air Force Reserve Unit was apparently scrambling to respond to the incoming threat, but there was a problem that Lisa could see immediately. The unit's pilots were conducting training exercises at another base, and the skeleton crew remaining at Denver didn't have enough qualified pilots to get all the aircraft into the air quickly enough to intercept the incoming hostiles. Lisa stood there for a moment, looking at the F-16s, calculating distances and time factors with the kind of tactical awareness that commercial aviation had never completely suppressed. The hostile aircraft would be over their targets in less than 20 minutes. Even if the reserve unit could scramble their available pilots, they might not be able to launch enough aircraft fast enough to prevent whatever attack was being planned. But Lisa could. She approached the nearest aircraft, her hands automatically checking the external systems and weapons load with the muscle memory of someone who had done these inspections thousands of times. The F-16 was armed with air-to-air missiles and had a full load of cannon ammunition. It was fueled for a combat mission and ready to launch. The only thing missing was a pilot. "Hey, you can't be here," a voice called from behind her. Lisa turned to see a young Air Force sergeant approaching, his hand on his sidearm, but his demeanor more confused than aggressive. He was clearly wondering how a civilian woman in a commercial pilot's uniform had gotten into a restricted military area. "Sergeant," Lisa said, her voice carrying an authority that made him pause, "I need to speak with your commanding officer immediately. We have a situation developing that requires immediate action." "Ma'am, you need to leave this area right now. This is a restricted military installation." Lisa looked at the sergeant, then at the F-16s, then back at the sergeant. She was about to cross a line that she had promised herself she would never cross again, about to reveal a secret that she had kept for over a decade. "Sergeant, my name is Captain Lisa Morgan. I'm a qualified F-16 pilot with over 2,000 hours in type, and I need one of these aircraft in the air right now." The sergeant stared at her, clearly trying to process this information. "Ma'am, that's impossible. You're wearing a civilian uniform. You're not on any pilot roster I've ever seen."
Lisa reached into her wallet and pulled out something she had hoped never to use again. A military ID card that identified her as Captain Lisa Morgan, United States Air Force, with a security clearance that was still technically active. "I'm also a test pilot. Level 5 clearance, Experimental Aircraft Division. I've been flying F-16 since before you were probably born." The sergeant looked at the ID, then at Lisa, then back at the ID. "This says you're active duty, but—" "It's complicated," Lisa said. "Right now we have hostile aircraft inbound to American airspace, and your unit doesn't have enough pilots to intercept them. I can help." Before the sergeant could respond, another voice cut through the conversation. "Captain Morgan?" Lisa turned to see a man in Air Force colonel's uniform approaching, his face showing a mixture of recognition and disbelief. She recognized him immediately, Colonel James Peterson, who had been a major when they had served together in the experimental flight test program over a decade ago. "Jim," Lisa said simply. "I thought you were dead," Peterson said, his voice carrying years of unanswered questions. "After the Nevada incident, when the program was shut down, we were told that all test pilots had been reassigned to classified operations. No one had heard from you in 10 years. Lisa looked at him, remembering the promise she had made when she left the test pilot program, that she would never reveal what she had learned, never speak about the aircraft she had flown, never use the skills she had developed except in the most extreme circumstances. "I've been flying commercial," she said quietly. "It seemed like a good way to stay in aviation without violating any security agreements." Peterson stared at her for a moment, then looked at the F-16s, then back at her. "You maintained your qualifications?" "Jim, I dream about flying these aircraft. I wake up every morning thinking about aerial combat maneuvers. You don't just lose that kind of training." Peterson was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Then his radio crackled with an urgent update. Colonel Peterson, this is NORAD Control. Hostile aircraft are now 15 minutes from target. We need immediate intercept capabilities, or we're looking at a significant loss of civilian life. Peterson looked at Lisa, then at the F-16s, then made a decision that would either save lives or end his career. Sergeant, prep aircraft 841242 for immediate launch, full air-to-air configuration. Sir, who's the pilot? Peterson, look at Lisa. Captain Morgan, you still remember how to start one of these? Lisa was already moving toward the aircraft, her hands automatically checking systems and controls with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from years of intensive training, like riding a bicycle.
But as she climbed into the cockpit, Lisa knew this was nothing like riding a bicycle. She was about to engage in aerial combat against unknown enemies, using skills she hadn't practiced in over a decade, flying an aircraft that represented the culmination of American military technology. As she strapped herself into the ejection seat and began the startup sequence, Lisa felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with preparing for combat. This was different from anything she had experienced in commercial aviation. This was personal, immediate, and deadly serious. Lisa, Peterson's voice came through her headset. You don't have to do this. We can wait for reinforcements. Try to handle this through diplomatic channels. Lisa looked at the instrument panel, at the weapons systems that she had once known better than any pilot in the Air Force. Jim, how many civilians will die if those aircraft reach their targets? Peterson was quiet for a moment. Intelligence estimates between 500 and 2,000 casualties, depending on their specific objectives. Lisa finished her startup checklist and felt the F-16's engine come to life with the familiar roar that had once been the soundtrack to her life. Then we don't wait for reinforcements. As she taxied toward the runway, Lisa's radio crackled with traffic from the air traffic control tower. Unknown military aircraft, this is Denver Control. You are not cleared for takeoff. Please state your intentions and authorization. Peterson's voice cut in immediately. Denver Control, this is Colonel Peterson, Colorado Air National Guard. We are responding to an active threat to American airspace under emergency authorization. Please clear runway 34L for immediate military departure. Colonel Peterson, we have no record of authorized military operations at this time. Please confirm your authority for this launch. Lisa keyed her microphone, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. Denver Control, this is Ghost Rider. I am launching under emergency combat authority. Please clear all civilian traffic from the area immediately. Ghost Rider had been her call sign during her test pilot days, a name she had earned for her ability to fly experimental aircraft that other pilots considered too dangerous. She had hoped never to use it again, but as she lined up on the runway, it felt appropriate. Ghost Rider, you are cleared for takeoff, came the reply, though Lisa could hear the confusion in the controller's voice. Lisa advanced the throttles to military power, feeling the familiar kick of the F-16's afterburner as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. Within seconds, she was airborne, climbing at a rate that would have been impossible in her commercial aircraft. As she climbed toward the intercept altitude, Lisa's training took over completely. The years of flying passenger jets disappeared, replaced by the tactical awareness and combat instincts that made her one of the Air Force's most skilled test pilots. At 25,000 feet, Lisa's radar picked up the incoming aircraft. 4 hostiles, flying in a tight formation, approaching at high speed. Their flight path confirmed intelligence estimates. They were heading directly toward Denver, probably targeting the airport, military installations, or the city's infrastructure. NORAD Control, this is Ghost Rider.
I have 4 bogies on radar, bearing 320, altitude 20,000 feet, speed 450 knots. Requesting permission to engage. Ghost Rider, you are cleared to engage. Weapons free. Repeat, weapons free. Lisa armed her missiles and cannon, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that came with the authorization to use lethal force. But this wasn't like the test flights or training exercises she remembered. This was real combat, with real consequences for failure. As she closed on the hostile aircraft, Lisa could see them clearly for the first time. They were indeed foreign military aircraft, flying with the confidence of pilots who hadn't expected to encounter resistance. But they were about to learn that American airspace was defended by people who took that responsibility very seriously. Unknown aircraft, this is the United States Air Force. You are in violation of American airspace. Change your heading immediately, or you will be engaged. There was no response. The hostile aircraft continued their approach toward Denver, apparently confident that they could complete their mission without effective opposition. Lisa armed her first AIM-120 missile and achieved radar lock on the lead aircraft. Her training took over completely, and she felt the familiar calm that came with combat preparation. This was what she had been trained for, what she had spent years preparing to do. Ghost Rider, Fox 3, she called, launching her first missile. The AIM-120 streaked away from her aircraft, guided by radar toward its target. Lisa watched as the hostile aircraft attempted evasive maneuvers, but the missile was too fast and too accurate. The lead aircraft exploded in a fireball that was visible for miles. The remaining 3 hostiles immediately broke formation, realizing they were under attack. But Lisa was already maneuvering for her next engagement, her hands moving across the controls with the kind of precision that could only come from years of intensive training. The second hostile aircraft turned toward her, apparently trying to engage in air-to-air combat. But Lisa had advantages that the hostile pilot couldn't have anticipated. She knew these airspaces, had trained in these skies, and was flying an aircraft that represented the absolute pinnacle of American military technology. Lisa pulled her F-16 into a vertical climb, using the aircraft's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain altitude advantage over her opponent. At the top of the climb, she rolled inverted and dove toward the hostile aircraft, positioning herself for a cannon attack. The M61 Vulcan cannon fired in short, precise bursts, each burst guided by years of training and combat instinct. The hostile aircraft disintegrated under the impact of 20-millimeter rounds traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. 2 down, 2 to go.
The remaining hostile aircraft were now trying to escape, apparently realizing that their mission had failed and that they were facing a pilot with capabilities they hadn't anticipated. But Lisa wasn't going to let them leave American airspace to potentially return another day. She engaged the third aircraft with another AIM-120 missile, watching as the hostile pilot attempted to evade but ultimately failed. The missile found its target, adding another fireball to the Colorado sky. The fourth and final hostile aircraft was now in a full retreat, diving toward the deck and heading back toward the border at maximum speed. But Lisa's F-16 was faster, and she was determined not to let any of the attackers escape. She caught up with the fleeing aircraft at low altitude, positioning herself behind and slightly above the hostile. This was the most dangerous part of the engagement, low-altitude combat with minimum room for error. But Lisa's training had prepared her for exactly this situation. A final cannon burst ended the engagement, and the threat to American airspace was neutralized. NORAD Control, this is Ghost Rider. 4 hostiles engaged and destroyed. American airspace is secure. Ghost Rider, outstanding work. Return to base for debrief. As Lisa turned her F-16 back toward Denver, she felt the familiar mixture of relief and exhaustion that followed combat. She had successfully defended American airspace, prevented what could have been a devastating attack on civilian targets, and proven that her skills hadn't diminished during her years of commercial flying. But she also knew that everything had changed. Her secret was out. Her quiet life as a commercial pilot was over, and she would have to face consequences that she had been avoiding for over a decade. As she approached Denver for landing, Lisa could see emergency vehicles and military personnel assembled on the tarmac. Emergency helicopters circled at a safe distance, and she knew that within hours, the story of the civilian airline pilot who had engaged and defeated 4 hostile military aircraft would be international news. Ghost Rider, this is Colonel Peterson. Outstanding work up there. That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. Lisa keyed her microphone, her voice carrying the fatigue that comes after intense combat. Thanks, Jim. It's good to know that some things never change. Lisa, you know this changes everything. There's going to be questions, investigations, probably congressional hearings. Your cover as a commercial pilot is blown. Lisa looked down at the Denver skyline, at the city that she had just protected from attack, at the thousands of people who would go about their lives never knowing how close they came to disaster. I know, she said simply, but some things are more important than maintaining cover.
As she landed and taxied back to the military section of the airport, Lisa could see the crowds gathering. Military personnel, government officials, and media representatives were all waiting to hear the story of how a commercial airline pilot had become an air combat hero in the space of a few hours. But first, she had to face her passengers. Lisa found them in the airport terminal, where they had been waiting for news about their delayed flight. When she walked in, still wearing her flight suit and carrying her helmet, their confusion was evident. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lisa said, her voice carrying the same professional calm they had heard during the flight. "I apologize for the delay and the confusion. There was an emergency situation that required my attention, but it has been resolved. You will be rebooked on other flights, and Atlantic Airways will cover all additional expenses." An elderly passenger raised her hand. "Captain, were you flying that military jet we saw taking off?" Lisa looked around the room, at the faces of people who had trusted her to safely transport them from Denver to Seattle, people who deserved to know the truth about what had happened. "Yes," she said simply. "I was." "But how? Why?" asked another passenger. Lisa took a breath, preparing to explain something that she had kept secret for 15 years. "Before I became a commercial pilot, I served in the United States Air Force as a test pilot. When hostile aircraft threatened American airspace today, I used those skills to protect our country and ensure your safety." The terminal erupted in applause. Passengers who had been frustrated about their delayed flight suddenly understood that their pilot had left them not to abandon her responsibilities, but to fulfill a much larger duty. Over the following days, Lisa's story became international news. The commercial pilot, who had secretly been one of America's most skilled military aviators, who had kept her combat skills sharp while flying passenger jets, who had risked everything to defend American airspace against hostile attack. There were indeed congressional hearings, military investigations, and intense scrutiny of the test pilot program that had trained her. But there was also recognition that Lisa had performed exactly as she had been trained to perform, that her actions had prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on American soil. The airline, initially confused about how her commercial pilot had access to military aircraft, ultimately supported her actions and offered her a position as their chief pilot for special operations, flights that might require the kind of unique skills she possessed. The Air Force, initially concerned about the security implications of having an active test pilot working in civilian aviation, ultimately concluded that Lisa's cover had actually been an asset, providing them with a trained combat pilot in exactly the position where she was needed most. But for Lisa, the most important recognition came from an unexpected source. Captain Morgan? Lisa turned to see a young girl, maybe 8 years old, standing with her parents in the Denver airport. "I was on your flight, the one that had to land early?" "I remember," Lisa said, kneeling down to the girl's eye level. "I'm sorry your trip was delayed." The girl shook her head seriously. "My daddy says you saved a lot of people that day. He says you're a hero." Lisa looked up at the girl's father, who nodded gratefully. "She's been talking about you all week. Says she wants to be a pilot like you when she grows up." Lisa smiled, thinking about the choices she had made, the secrets she had kept, and the moment when everything had changed. "You can be anything you want to be," she told the girl. "But remember, being a hero isn't about flying fast planes or doing dangerous things. It's about being ready to help people when they need you most." Years later, when Lisa would tell this story to new pilots in the commercial aviation program she eventually developed, she would always end with the same message. You never know when your past training will be exactly what the present moment requires. Stay ready, stay sharp, and never forget that the skills you develop aren't just for the job you're doing today. They're for the job you might be called to do when everything is on the line. The secret test pilot had become a public hero, but more importantly, she had proven that some responsibilities transcend job descriptions, that some duties are worth any personal cost, and that when American airspace is threatened, it will be defended by people who understand that freedom requires constant vigilance. Lisa Morgan had spent 15 years hiding her true capabilities, but when the moment came to use them, she had been ready, and America was safer because she had never forgotten who she really was, even when the world saw only who she appeared to be.